Hello everybody, thanks again for joining me. It's Azure Chris, and we're going to continue on our 10 steps to get started with Azure for Partners. Today we're talking about number 9, this is storage in Azure. So we talked about virtual networks, then we talked about virtual machines, and now we're going to talk about the different types of storage or data that you can store in Azure. So first I think we should think about the different types of data, right? Well, let's classify them. So the first one would be structured data. And that could be something like a human resources database, right? Employee database, or maybe a customer database where you're gonna have first name, last name, maybe address, maybe the last deal that's been sold or something like that, right? Social security number, things like that. You know that data is always gonna have kind of static schema, right? You're always gonna have those values. It's not really gonna change. You know what you wanna save about your customers or your human resources, your employees, right? That is perfect for a relational database, right? And that could be SQL database. And you can store that data right into Azure SQL Database or SQL Managed Instance or traditional SQL Server on a virtual machine, right? Those are the 3 different methods. And that would be perfect for structured data. The second classification we have is semi-structured data, right? And that could be along the lines of another database or kind of all these different values, but maybe the data and the schema is going to be changing, right? Maybe you have a storefront like Walmart or Target or the Microsoft store or something, and the latest widget now has a new technology feature. Maybe it's Bluetooth now, and last year it didn't. Now you have a new value, a new row or column, right? And that's going to be changing very often. So a relational database like SQL wouldn't be the best fit for that. We're going to go with a NoSQL database, and Microsoft has their NoSQL database, and it's called Cosmos DB. And you would leverage APIs on it. You can have MongoDB, Cassandra, or Gremlin, just to name some of the popular ones, right? And you could pull that data into Azure and store it right into Cosmos DB that way, right? The third classification would be non-structured data, and that could be media files, right? Maybe it's large movies or audio files, right? Maybe it's Word documents or Excel files, PowerPoints, things that traditionally live on a file server, right? That's non-structured data. And there's a mechanism in Azure for that, right? First, you'd have to create a storage account, and we'll talk about storage accounts a little bit when I get into the demo. But that would live on Blob Storage. So there are different types of ways to get that in there, but the mechanism probably would be Azure File or just traditional Blob or something like that. So those are the 3 classifications of data. The other thing we can think about is the virtual machines, right? So actually storing operating systems, things like that, right? That would be virtual machine disks. And those live on blobs as well, but you don't have to create the storage account for that. You just go through the virtual machine creation wizard and you pick your either managed disks or unmanaged disks. And the way you can think about it is managed disks are kind of, you wouldn't have to worry about it if you were a storage administrator. You wouldn't have to worry about the IOPS and the trays, right, and the LUN groups and balancing all the data across those equally to make sure that you get the best performance. Azure does that for you. That's a managed disk. Unmanaged disk is if you want that control, if you want to be able to manipulate the IOPS and the data and all that stuff per storage account, right? So now that we understand the different types of data, we're going to talk about moving that data into Azure, right? So for relational databases and non-SQL databases like Cosmos DB, you can use the database migration service, the DMS. And DMA, right? So for database migration assessment. So it'll look at your database, it'll tell you kind of what's on it, and say if if you have a database here, is it a good fit to be moved into Azure, right? And it'll look at that and it'll help you migrate it in there. Some other tools might be AZ copy, or maybe it's a backup and restore, or an import export service if it's a large data set, right? For the file server data, there's another mechanism. You could also use AZ copy, but if you had file servers here, say on-prem, and maybe you had file servers across the whole country or the world, you could install an agent on each one of the file servers, and you can create a Azure file on Blob in Azure, and all the different file servers that you have set up across your environment will all start to replicate all that data into Azure, and then Azure becomes that central repository. That way, when you start building out workloads here, you can access that data locally without going through your express route or your VPN tunnel to get back to that data. Also, that lends itself great if you're going to do something like Azure Virtual Desktop, right? And you're going to have all your virtual environment here, and your end users are able to get to that file server data here. So Azure Files and SMB share, great technology there, and I'll show you where to go to set that up. So this is really high level what I wanted to cover here. We're gonna jump on the desktop. I'm gonna show you a ton of documentation. You can read through it, get a better understanding of what I'm talking about, and hopefully you can find this stuff useful and use it on your day-to-day. Let's just jump right into it. Hey everybody, thanks for sticking with me. It's Azure Chris, and we're going to continue on our 10 steps to get started with Azure for Partners. And we're talking about number 9. So this is storing data in Azure. So if you've seen any of my other previous blog posts, I always start at my page, right, azurechris.com. And I'd like to put all this information together in one page for you to be able to find it. So really kind of Microsoft Docs, Microsoft Learn Labs, modules, things like that. And to start, I have links already right here. So Introduction to Azure Storage. And if you caught my introduction, you know I talk about classifying data, right? And the 3 different types of classification: structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. Well, these 2 links kind of break that down and go into it in depth. When we talk about the storage accounts, right, and I had mentioned that, in which you don't have to do that for virtual machines, and you don't have to create storage accounts really if you're doing SQL or NoSQL, Cosmos DB, but these are the offerings when it comes to really storage accounts. So all this stuff is really blobs that are created in storage accounts, but files, yeah, Azure Files as well as a storage account. But disks, they're blobs, like I said, but they're not created in storage accounts. This here is all the services as it relates to databases, right? So when I talk to you about relational databases versus non-SQL databases, this is kind of an image that lets you kind of conceptualize that. So let's start in the first link here. I have Introduction to Azure Storage. Great link here. It is in the overview of Azure Blob Storage documentation, right? And this will go into kind of all those different things that I talked about, right? All the different services, all the different things that you might leverage data for. And it provides links for all of them, right? So we talked about Azure Blob Storage. We talked about Azure Files. There's also Azure Queue and Table Storage. Queue storage is for messaging, so between application components. So micro-segmentation, maybe one part of the application is waiting for a response for another, and it's going to be receiving a lot of messages, and you don't want the other part of the application to kind of, you know, to start dropping messages, so you create a buffer. Really a queue where messages just kind of line up, and when that second target application piece is ready to take those messages, it then takes it on, right? Azure Storage is Microsoft Azure's kind of first NoSQL platform. It's now considered legacy, but there are some folks out there that have already been using it, and they're using it in production. And this is for that schemaless, you know, kind of semi-structured data. If you were going to start from scratch now, you should leverage Cosmos DB, right? And then it talks about Azure Disk, so that's block level storage, right, for Azure virtual machines. It then goes to the examples. When would you use each one of these, right? Azure Storage, you know, file shares, right? We talked about blobs, unstructured data, right? Actually makes up Azure Files. It's consistent of blob storage. Then talks about Azure Disks, right? And when you would use that for attaching virtual hard disks, right? And then it goes into Azure Queues and tables as well, right? And when you would use that. And then it goes and drills down even more into those different subsections, right? So blobs, serving images and documents directly to a browser, storing files for distributed access, things like that. Video and audio, what I talked about, right? Goes through Azure Files, talking about its SMB protocol, right? And on-premise applications for file shares and extending that, leveraging Azure File Sync, things like that, right? And it just provides all these definitions. And then it talks about encryption, right? It also talks about the file, the shared access keys, right? So this is about securing your storage account. So when you create blob storage in storage accounts, there's ways to get through it. You can leverage Storage Explorer, you can do SAS tokens, or you can use the shared access signature, the SAS key. SAS key is one way to secure things, but that is kind of, the SAS token is actually a more secured way where you can put time parameters around it and saying only a certain user can have it for X amount of time. But SAS keys are great. You want to make sure that you be careful who you grant access to with those SAS keys. Usually just administrators or applications, right, that they're going to do some automated things. Like if I were to do a SQL database or something like that, and it was going to store something, it could use a SAS key. So you could do it that way. We talk about encryption at rest, client-side encryption. We then talk about redundancy. Big topic, huge topic, but I didn't really talk about it in the introduction. If I were to expand this link here real quick and we take a look at it, there are a couple of different redundancies to consider. There's actually a few of them. LRS, ZRS, and GRS. So LRS is locally redundant storage here, and look how many nines you get for an SLA. That is just all the replication happens in that local data center. If that's not enough for you, then you go to zone redundant storage, where you have different copies, 3 different copies actually in the same region, but different data centers. So if one goes down, you have that data in a different data center in the same region. And then we scroll down, and did I miss geo redundant, zone redundant? No, I didn't. Redundancy in second region, and then there's geo redundant. So if one zone isn't enough, like the East US, or that one region isn't enough, you can do geo redundant, where you're replicating your traffic between, say, East continental US and West continental US, right? So geo redundant, or maybe even farther. And then we talk about read-only GRS, right? So if a second application is going to get access to that, but there's some nuance, some caveats to really drill into this documentation, right? And talk to your cloud architect when you start getting into these type of feature sets, right? So this is great documentation here. Let me bounce back out of this. And in the introduction, tons of links, tons of things to drill down into when you're going to take advantage of this technology. So I'll close that out. That was the first one, and now we're going to jump to the second link. So the second link was actually when I talked about the classifications. I'll click on this link. So understanding the different store models for relational database, right? And then it talks about semi-structured structured query language, SQL, right? Relational databases. And all the different types of relational databases that Azure offers, right? So Azure SQL Database, MySQL, Postgre, MariaDB, the different workloads, kind of what those workloads will be doing, the data types, many-to-one relationship, database schemas are required and enforced, data is highly normalized, like stuff that's not really changing, right? Inventory management, order management, things like that. And this is kind of a representation of that key value pair that I talked about in the intro. We then go down to a second service, so a Cosmos DB, table API, right? And I talked about the table storage, Cosmos DB, cache for Reddish, table storage. And it talks about the different workloads that would use that, right? And we talked about storefronts and different things like that. Session management, profile management. You can actually see this in this document database, this example they have here. So you can see the customer, you can see the ordered item, the product that it is, the quantity. So you can see how it's actually a storefront in this example. And this is JSON format, that notation there. And then it drills down into Cosmos DB even more with SQL API, and when you would use the SQL API in Cosmos DB and what workloads that would be, and it would be like a graph database, right? Then talks about Gremlin API and understanding kind of relationships between the data, right? And if you want to think about it, you'd say in like a storefront that you bought something, and it would say, oh, you bought that, maybe you'll like this, right? That's Gremlin API, right? So when you start drilling into this technology, you really started to get a great understanding of who's using this stuff, right? And kind of what live scenarios are actually getting the most out of these feature sets. We then drill down to even more kind of advanced stuff. This is large data sets with data lakes and Synapse, or taking advantage of like Enterprise BI and Power BI to kind of comb through all this data and just to try to determine trends and things like that, right? To understand your data better. This is what these features and these services offer. So really, it drills down even more Azure Search, time series insights. It then gets to blob storage and data lakes, and then it talks about Azure Files, and all of them have links to this stuff where you can drill down to it even more, right? And this is from the Azure Architecture Center, so that's why you can see how it's meant for cloud architects like myself, or all you partners out there and customers that are really going to start drilling down into this technology. It gets deeper into it. So let's jump out of this link and we jump back to my blog page here. This write-ups here in between the links and the images is kind of what I wrote. A lot of it is really kind of what I talked about in the introduction, but feel free to read through it. We talk about structured data here, right, with the different classifications. That was the first one I covered. And for that reason, I give you that key value paired image there. But I provide this link here, which is Azure SQL Fundamentals. If you were to click on it, it's going to take you to the Microsoft Learn. It's a module filled with 6 modules here, about 7 hours. So if you wanted to start, getting into the world of SQL and relational databases in Azure, this is probably a great place for you to start, right? So it gives you sandbox, gives you labs, provides you, exercises, right? Deploying Azure SQL Database, verifying data without you guys incurring costs in your own tenant, right? Within your own account there. So great stuff here. I definitely suggest that you jump into that as well. We scroll down, and the next stuff is semi-structured data, right? So we're talking about that here. This is Cosmos DB, also, Azure Table Storage, but I don't really have any highlighted links on my page for that. But if I click that here, another Microsoft module. I actually love this one. I think Cosmos DB technology is fantastic. Like I talked about, when you get into the Gremlin API and things like that, it's amazing. So this will help you kind of understand partition keying, making sure that you don't have hot partitions, and that you're not just reading and writing one partition and then you're incurring all this charge. So really making sure that you have a good design for your Cosmos DB when you move forward. And then, like I said, there's MongoDB, Gremlin, and all the different APIs there. And then there's exercises for actually leveraging Cosmos DB and getting into it. So we talk about that, and then we get to the unstructured data, right? That was the third classification, right? And that, I highlight, there's a lot of storage account stuff, and there's queue and table storage and all that, but I think that the Azure Files is probably one of the the highest priority, one of the services that customers and partners are really kind of taking advantage of the most, right? So it's that SMB share, and this is with on-premise file servers, right? And you can see that Azure File Sync agent, and that gets replicated into Azure, and then your clients here, whether it's Azure Virtual Desktop or a workload or something like that, then has access to that same data without traversing that express route, right, or VPN, right? So that saves you costs, right, and latency and performance. We then click on this link that I've highlighted here, and it takes you to, guess what, another Microsoft Learn. And this is a great one, really high level here though. I would, talk about planning your Azure file deployment, great images here to understand kind of how that is broken out under the covers. Really talking about for developers and cloud-based apps and who should have access. And your data access method talks about standard and performance tiers and what kind of performance you should expect around that. And then we talk about that resiliency, right? LRS, ZRS, GRS. And I talked about importing data, right? And we talked about Azure File Sync and replication. But for all of the different methods to get data in there, right? We can talk about large data sets. You can use DataBox or Azure Import Export. You can use Storage Explorer, and we'll look at that when I jump on the Azure Portal. There's also a great tool called AZ Copy, which is a command line tool where you can do source, target. The target's generally going to be, Azure, and you can even do it from one storage account to another. And you can do some like really nice, cool stuff with like replication and syncing between different storage accounts. So, great tool. You should look at that as well. And then even here some quizzes, right? So, yeah, fantastic stuff here. And then, like I said, there's exercise and everything and building that out. So we jump out of there, and the next thing we're talking about, right, was the fourth kind of data storage in Azure, which was virtual machines, right, which are blobs, they're page blobs, but there's different things that you need to think about when you're going to start applying storage to virtual machines, right? And if I were to click on this link here, it would take me to another Azure Learn or Microsoft Learn link here. And I think this is a great one here. We talk about managed and unmanaged, and when to use what. Managed, just like I said, is the IOPS, right? So Microsoft has control over that. It's a lot easier for you to just kind of load up in a virtual machine and let Azure worry about all that, features and functionalities. With normally you'd have a storage administrator would have to worry about that for you. And then it talks about unmanaged disks, right, where you can get that granularity and you can control the IOPS and the performance of the storage account underneath it. Some quiz and questions there as well. I'll bounce back out. There's another one, and if I click here and I show you this image here, you'll see this in that link. So not only is it managed and unmanaged, we have to think about the performance, right? So do you want traditional spinning disk or do you want SSDs? And there's different types of SSDs, right? There's ultra disks for super high IOP, low latency workloads. And you can see the throughput and the IOPS there. And then you have premium SSD, which is one step down. Generally, you'll use this for production workloads. You could probably get by with standard SSD, but when you use premium SSD, you get an SLA tied to the workload, your virtual machine with that. So like I said, for production workloads, you're probably going to want to stick with premium SSD for that. And like I said, then we go down to standard SSD, and that's going to be third on the list as far as performance. The last one is going to be traditional hard disks, spinning disk, right? And you can see how that's the slowest IOPS and the slowest throughput. Might want to use that for, non-production workloads, slow workloads, things like that, right? And there's even a quiz there. So that's why I think this is a great tutorial, fantastic information, and then, even more information there. So I'll close out of that and jump back into here. Coming to the end of the blog page now, but really I wanted to provide these two links here. So these are actually the kind of parent modules for all those labs that I gave you. Not all of them, actually, not the Cosmos and the SQL, but if you were to store data, this is high level storage stuff here. Some of the one from the other link actually overlaps, but you can see this module has really good stuff here. Securing applications with Blob Storage, securing your storage account, connecting it to app storage, and creating a storage account, which I'll show you in a couple of minutes. So like I said, this is kind of the main module, and then it breaks down into all those other learning paths underneath it. This is the second one here, architecting storage. And this one, you can see the classifying the data, which I covered in the introduction, right? And that's going to be the structured data. There's a great video here where it talks about structured data, semi-structured data, and the unstructured data, right? And even a little quiz. So great modules here, great stuff. If you're going for your Azure certificate, the administrator or the architect certificate, this is the one for you. The storing Azure, you could probably leverage that other link for if you're going to be an administrator. But like I said, some of them overlap, some of them don't. This one wasn't in the other module, right? And this is leveraging Storage Explorer. That one was in the other one, but then this one has the read access geo-redundant storage. This one had that. This one has the Azure files, right? So that's why I said all those other links, some of the other links there you'll find in this parent module series of 9 modules there. So I'll bounce out of that and go back to my blog site. It's the last write-up. We already covered this, the ultra disk, the premium storage, and the SSDs, things like that. But that's my write-up there. That's really what I wanted to show you from my blog page. So let's jump on to the Azure Portal, and I'll show you what it looks like with a storage account and things like that in the Azure Portal. So we're now in the Azure Portal, and I have some workloads here. I've been working on a bunch of different labs, but I'm going to jump into a storage account. I want to show you kind of what that looks like if you want to just get started with storage. Storage accounts are created for a lot of things in Azure, right? It's considered almost like the backbone of Azure. But this here, I've already used the Cloud Shell where I could do command line activity against Azure Fabric, right? And create a lot of this stuff without using the Azure Portal. This is a storage account that saves my history for all the Cloud Shell commands I have. This storage account that is created was for Azure Site Recovery. So I'm protecting some workloads. I'm doing some disaster recovery demos. And when you do disaster recovery demos, you are replicating storage from your source to a cache storage account, and then it replicates it to the target area. So when you create site recovery and when you start working into that in your recovery services vault, it'll create storage for you. But I'm going to click on create here, and we're going to walk through the wizard real quick and let you see how it looks. So first off, it's going to ask you what subscription you want to put it, and then it's going to ask you what resource group. Maybe I will tie it to SQL Database, right? Maybe I want SQL Database to be able to store data in this. And I can use this, something that is, it has to be globally unique, and it has to be all lowercase. So you have to, I used, Azure Chris storage account or something like that, right? Let me do, make sure this is good. Azure Chris storage account. Actually, I didn't like that. Maybe it's too long. Easy, one more, and there we go. So it likes that. It was a little bit too long. I talked about general purpose 1, general purpose 2, but I'll cover it a little bit more. So general purpose 1 was created initially for Azure, right? That was the first kind of legacy storage blob container that they created. Like I said, it's now legacy. They have general purpose 2, which has all the bells and whistles. But in some cases, you still want to build out something in general purpose 1. So for example, I was talking about Azure Site Recovery. It's actually cheaper to protect your workloads on general purpose 1 disk than it is general purpose 2 because of the features and functionality. But for those reasons, maybe you want to use something that's advanced like private endpoints or something like that. You'd have to leverage general purpose 2. So if you wanted to do general purpose 1, you'd have to click here. By default, it's going to do general purpose 2 here. You then select your performance, right? Standard, premium, I talked about that. And then the redundancy, LRS, GRS, ZRS, globally zone redundant storage, right? And you can kind of select whatever your customer needs. We then go to the advanced tab, and there's a ton of different options here, and I'll just cover some of them, right? So enabling infrastructure encryption, you can get into that. Data lakes, if you wanted to kind of work around that stuff and setting up your namespace that's appropriate. If you knew you were going to do, actually before I skip that, let's talk about access tiers. So I talked about data in blob storage and saving data and maybe Azure files, things like that. So if knowing your customers, knowing their habits, not all data is accessed all the time. Data that's frequently accessed will be hot tier, and that is going to be kind of more expensive for the read writes. But that is the one that you would use most often when you have stuff in production. Cool storage is for stuff that might be 90 days out, 120 days out, that is less frequently utilized, and you would store it on cheaper disk. If you wanted to pull it back, it would be more expensive for you, but that's why it's infrequently accessed. There's actually a third that's archive as well. Archive storage is stuff that's maybe compliance hold, litigation hold, 7 years, right? You don't expect to read that stuff, it's just there just in case. And that is kind of really expensive to pull back out, right? There's no, you're not worried about how long it takes. It can take like 24 hours to pull that data back, right? So then we go to Azure Storage. If you want large file shares, you'd enable that. Tables and queues for customer managed keys, you'd enable that there. We then jump into networking. So by default, it's public endpoint, so anything could have access to this blob that I'm creating. You probably don't want to do that. You can do public endpoints and select which network under my networks that you already have created, or you can create a new one, or you can do a private endpoint where I create a private endpoint and only workloads in that virtual network have access to that storage, right? And that's more advanced, but definitely more secure. We then go into data protection, and we talk about soft deleting blobs, things like that, right? So kind of like a recycle bin. So if I deleted something, I could get it back. And how long is it going to retain that stuff? You can kind of mess with those days and change those values if you wanted to. We then talk about tracking and versioning and things like that. We then go to tags, just like everything else in Azure, and review and create. It passed the validation, and I'll click create. So it takes a little bit to create this account in Azure. Like I said, this is just storage account stuff. If I were to do something like SQL or Cosmos DB, I would have to go into those blades to create that stuff, just like the Microsoft Labs talk about, right? And you would have to use something like a database migration service to pull that data in there. So that's different stuff, and I won't cover that in this demo. I just wanted to show you this real quick. So really quick to create a storage account. You can see how fast it provisioned it. I'll go to the resource, and now we're in my storage account, right? So we're in the overview blade here. You can see it's hot standard. It took by default RAGRS. I could have did local redundant storage, which is cheaper by default. It's telling me it's general purpose V2. It succeeded with provisioning, and then I can scroll down and look at the properties. And you can see how these services are currently disabled because I haven't enabled anything yet. And then I can switch through these tabs and look at monitoring and the capabilities, recommendations, and there's even some tutorials in here as well, right? But I can scroll down, and then you see actually at the top, it said Open in Explorer. So that's Storage Explorer, and it's here. Storage Explorer and Storage, the browser here, it's in the Azure Blade, and it says, preview. I can use it here, but there's actually a download. So you can go out on Google and Google, Azure Storage Explorer, and you can download the actual application. So you don't have to go into the Azure Portal, and you can import your keys. And I talk about the access keys here. And I had talked about that when you're using Blob Storage and stuff like that, and granting access to it. You would use those keys in Storage Explorer that you downloaded to grant access and things. So we're going to jump and we're going to look at data storage. We have containers, file shares, queues, and tables. If I wanted to go into containers, Azure blobs are stored inside containers. There's already one here that's created by default, which is logs based on the logs for the Azure platform. If I wanted to do application or app data, like I said, maybe this is going to be for a SQL database or something like that. I have it created here, and I can generate SAS keys. I can create an access policy. I can change the access level, change the metadata. So there's a lot of stuff I can do even here by clicking those dots, or I can click in it. And there's some more things here with the access tokens and access policy. But from here, I can also upload. If I clicked here, I could browse my local machine and upload something right to a blob storage. So really easy for you once to kind of just get started and start kicking the tires there. We talked about the shared access tokens, right? And when people, how long, right? I can do scheduled, that maybe they only have it for a certain amount, or maybe 24 hours, they're gonna do some work, and from an allowed IP address or something like that, right? And we talk about the access policies. You can get even more granular with that. So we have an Azure blob created, right? What if we want to do Azure File with an SMB share? I can click on File Shares here. There's nothing configured. My capacity is telling me I have a max of 5 terabytes. Soft delete's already configured for 7 days, and Active Directory is not configured. And you can do that. You can incorporate your SMB share with traditional Active Directory, so your NTFS permissions can kind of work with you while you're in Azure as well. But I'll do company files, share. And quota I can set to max, and I'll just leave it as transaction optimized for now. Maybe it's going to be heavily utilized there. And really quick, it's already created an SMB share. I already have it. Like I said, I can click on these radio buttons. I can edit the quota. I can connect to it. I can take snapshots of it. I can delete the share. I can look at the properties. I can also drill down into it even more, and I can upload files directly into it as well. So this is huge. From here, I can then set up snapshots and backups of my file server. And like I said, I would then go and Google Azure File Sync, the software, install it on my file server, and all your file servers would then populate these shares here, and you would see that stuff all replicated. So some fantastic stuff there. I'm considering doing some blogs later on that drill down into kind of all these different labs, and we'll see how that happens. But then I can, kind of scroll down here and I can look at networking. Like I talked about, I can isolate the traffic. I can, publish it only to select virtual networks, and I can change that here. Access keys, once again, encryption, geo-replication. It is, RAGRS, so then I have east and I have west, and I can prepare for a failover. So great information here, guys. I really wanted to just start off and show you that here in the Azure Portal. I didn't want to take too much of your time. I know some of these blogs are getting long, but let me know how you like it. Click like, click subscribe on the YouTube channel. Let me know what you think. If there's anything I can change, anything you want to see. If you do want to see an Azure file with a file server replicating, let me know. I can create a blog for that and a video and how to set that up. Let me know. Like I said, click like, click subscribe. Let me know what you think, and catch me on the next one, number 10. We're going to be talking about protecting workloads in Azure for disaster recovery. We're going to delve deeper into Azure Site Recovery. So catch me on the next video, and I hope to talk to you soon. Take care, everybody.